Well, I'm really excited to be joined right now with Mike Brennan, a meteorologist with the National Hurricane Center. Mike, let's talk about some of the things that are going on from NHC for the upcoming hurricane season.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be with you. So, yeah, we're not too far away from the start of the 2025 hurricane season. So the main message, as we head into this time of year is a big focus on preparedness, understanding what your risk is. And there in, Tidewater, Virginia, there's a lot of vulnerability to hurricanes, from coastal flooding and storm surge to wind to heavy rainfall, tornadoes. Those are all in play for that region. In terms of things that are going to be a little different here at the Hurricane Center, we have our experimental cone graphic that's going to continue to be available in 2025. We introduced this in the 2024 hurricane season. It shows the inland extent of the tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings. This is an example from Hurricane Milton last year, where we had watches and warnings up for almost the entire state of Florida. Similarly for Helene. So if we had a storm threatening the mid-Atlantic coast, northeastern North Carolina, you would see these broad areas painted over top of the cone itself to show you what the risk is from those wind hazards with those tropical storm or hurricane watches and warnings. So this graphic will continue to be available this hurricane season on our website at hurricanes.gov.
It seems like it's a subtle difference, but it really does help us tell the story. And I assume the feedback that you got at the Hurricane Center must have been very positive with this, kind of highlighting some of these inward or inland extent of some of these impacts.
Yeah, it really was. And if you go back and you look at an example for Hurricane Helene last year, too, you can again see for a storm that moved very quickly inland, the entire portions of multiple states under those watches and warnings. So it's a really easy way to show that risk from those substantial wind threats that can travel very, very far inland. And even for a storm affecting, southeastern Virginia, northeast North Carolina, it could be a storm that makes landfall along the Gulf Coast of Florida or farther south in the Carolinas. Maybe not a direct landfall, but could still bring substantial impacts.
No, in fact, most of the ones that do have the impacts to our area come in at least cutting across North Carolina, if not coming up through the Gulf, and then kind of the remnants finding their way to Hampton Roads. So that's an excellent point. I think one of the things we have as a challenge, Mike, and you may face the same thing down there, how do we best and most clearly explain some of these threats to folks? We still have some folks here in coastal Virginia. They generally heed advice like get out or get off the coast. But there are still some challenges in really driving home what these big threats are.
Yeah, especially in the Hampton Roads area, storm surge is a tremendous threat. You've got a metro area that's surrounded by water, the Chesapeake Bay, the Atlantic coast. And so there's a lot of water around, and that is one of the bigger threats. And, storm surge, we try to communicate the risk of that with the storm surge watch and warning, where we are able to highlight those areas that are at risk of life-threatening inundation from storm surge. And that risk generally starts when we get to about 3 or 4 feet of inundation above ground level. So you can see, some people here on the graphic give an idea of how tall they are, but you get to 3 or 4 feet, that's over the heads of most kids. It's going to be about waist deep water on most adults. And if you get to inundation, 5 or 6 feet above ground level, you're talking about over the tops of most people's heads. I'm 6 feet tall, so 6 feet of inundation is going to be up at the top of my head. And that's really not an environment you want to stay in. And it's important to remind people that storm surge is generally what drives most evacuation orders from local government officials in tropical storms and hurricanes. Those are the areas you need to leave so that you can stay away from that storm surge risk. And it's important to remind people you don't always have to drive 100 or 200 miles to get out of that storm surge risk area. You might only have to drive 10 or 20 miles to a safe place outside of that storm surge evacuation zone.
Yeah, it's all about the elevation, no doubt. Now, we're going to go just a little bit into the weeds here. A lot of times when we communicate water levels, we base it on the average of the lower low tides, what we call mean lower low water. Going to this inundation communication, and again, we're embracing it because the Hurricane Center is now using this and we want to stay consistent as best we can. But is there a way to understand how, you say 3 feet of inundation, is that at average sea level, above average sea level, or how do you guys, what is the best way for us to communicate it to our audience?
Yeah, when we talk about inundation and when you look at, say, the storm surge inundation graphic or the potential storm surge flooding graphic, that's calculated above ground level at that particular location. So when we talk about inundation here, if you're looking at a map where your home is and it says 3 to 6 feet, that means at that location, the water could be 3 to 6 feet above the ground level at that particular point. So it allows us to better convey what the inundation risk above ground level is over a much broader area rather than tying it to a tide level at a particular tide gauge, which is only representative of a point.
No, very good information there. Of course, a lot of the folks historically that deal with this kind of understand where they are relative to those tide gauges, but you make a great point. So no arguments here. Now, Mike, while I have you, I got to ask you about the upcoming hurricane season. You know, we talked about the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the fact that we're kind of going back to a neutral phase, what we call La Nada. That takes a little bit of the predictability. It can change things up a little bit in terms of historically what we've seen. What's the current thinking from the Hurricane Center on what kind of a season may be upcoming?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, El Nino, La Nina are sort of the more predictable parts of what a seasonal or a hurricane outlook looks like in the Atlantic. And when neither of them is present, it does inject a little more uncertainty. Our official hurricane forecast for the season from NOAA doesn't come out until later in May, so I can't speak to any details. But, you know, we have been in a pretty active period over the last 20 to 30 years in the Atlantic. And just since 2017, we've had 25 hurricane landfalls in the United States, 5 of them last year. Now, most of those hurricane landfalls have been along the Gulf Coast, but we have seen some on the East Coast as well, the East Coast of Florida up into the Carolinas. So the main message for people is you have to prepare every season, regardless of what any seasonal forecast says. It could be a quiet season overall, but if we have 4 or 5 storms that make landfall in the United States along the East Coast, it's going to feel like a busy season. And in a place where you have as much risk as you do in the Hampton Roads area, southeastern Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, that's an area where you have to be ready every year, starting June all the way through October and November.
Yeah, our advice year after year is always be prepared. It only takes one to hit your area to make it the worst season on record. So no doubt about that. I'm interested to know also, while I have you, and this is great, I really appreciate your time. Last year, we had that freakishly warm Atlantic basin and the MDR, record warmth early in the season. It was like what we might typically expect to find in August, during the peak of the Cape Verde season. This year, still warm, maybe not quite as warm. Did you guys as forecasters collectively go, wow, we had that period where there just wasn't much development in spite of that warmth? Were you surprised last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody remembers it got really quiet in the Atlantic through August and even into, portions of early September. But we did have, Hurricane Beryl that formed out over the main development region in late June, which is not the area you would expect to see in a typical season. But you're right, because of those very warm waters, we had Beryl form and become a Category 4 and then Category 5 hurricane in the Caribbean in early July, which was unprecedented in terms of the formation date. But yeah, you're right. We had that sort of pause mid-season, but then things got really busy again in September and October. And the challenge with that is when you start to get busy that time of year, the activity shifts back over to the western part of the basin, where you're going to get that development a lot closer to the United States and the Gulf, the Caribbean, and the Bahamas. And that makes it much more likely that you're going to have those storms start to affect land compared to storms that might form out of the main development region and then have some chance to recurve away from land.
Yeah, good points. Good points. One thing, you guys have done an amazing job really with the forecasting accuracy and the tracks. It has been, as long as I've been doing this, and again, I mentioned before, I started back in '89, and I've had a hand in hurricane forecasting from a broadcast standpoint for decades now. But that intensity can still be somewhat of a challenge. Last second fluctuations. How do you guys feel about that? How are you feeling about all of the advancements? Again, the Hurricane Center does a remarkable job. Are you seeing, more improvements in the modeling? Are you feeling good about it? Where are we with this?
Yeah, we've come a long way in forecasting intensity. If you remember, you've been around in the first 20 years of your career, intensity forecasting accuracy for hurricanes really hadn't changed very much, all the way from the late 1980s into the 2000s. It was kind of just steady state. We didn't make a lot of progress. But since that time, we've cut our average intensity forecast errors about in half. We've started to get more data from the hurricane hunters aircraft into the models, and that's improved their forecast. We've started to make more aggressive forecasts of rapid intensification now. Our average error when rapid intensification occurs is about half of what it was even just 10 or 15 years ago. So when you have these storms that develop close to home, like a Helene, like a Milton, where they are going to rapidly intensify, now we're making a lot more aggressive forecasts than we used to. We're not getting them exactly right. A lot of times the storms get even a little stronger than we forecast, or the timing is off, but we're at least able to sort of anticipate now when that rapid intensification can occur. We still have a long way to go, but we have made a lot of progress there.
Mike, it's been amazing again, and you and your colleagues do a tremendous job. Last question, looking forward, is there anything that gets you really excited about the future of hurricane research or forecasting and how we're handling this as a partnership and as a community, just informing our public?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always things coming in the pipeline, new observation tools. We've got small UASs or drones that we're now flying out of the Hurricane Hunter aircraft down near the ocean surface, collecting data where we really haven't ever been able to collect data before, because you can't fly a crewed aircraft down at 100 feet above the ocean surface. New ways to observe storms from space. We have a new GOES satellite that is now operational over the over the Atlantic and eastern U.S. this year. So we're seeing details. We're getting data that we never really had visibility on before. And so it's a long process to take that research and transition it into something that we use as an operational tool here. We're looking at AI technology in terms of modeling and observations that we're starting to incorporate into our forecast process here as well. So there's a lot of exciting developments that are in the pipeline that working towards operations.
Mike, great stuff. Thank you so much for your time, and thank everybody there at the Hurricane Center. Again, as a user, as somebody that takes all of these forecast updates and then conveys that to the public, the work you're doing is significant and it really helps us out. So thank you guys, and thank everybody else you work with there.
Thanks so much.